Hello, my name is Kevin McCarthy, and I am a member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and thank you for attending this evening's program. The Dole Student Advisory Board is composed of KU students committed to the bipartisan mission of the Dole Institute. Members of the SAB receive great opportunities to network with our special guests and preference when applying for our internship assistance program or for paid student positions at the Institute. If you're a student and you would like to join, please contact the Dole Institute. We'd like to encourage each of you to get special benefits and support the Dole Institute by becoming a friend. Please contact us if you are interested. The Dole Institute would like to hear from you. If you enjoy this evening's program, please let us know by contacting us on Facebook, Twitter, or through our website email. To view past programs, visit our online video archive at www.doleinstitute.org. Before we begin tonight, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. After the interview, we will have some time for audience questions and answers. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and a student helper with a microphone will come to you. Please ask just one brief question. Hearing assistance is available, and we have a loop seating section at each program designated by a sign. If you have any questions about the loop, or if at any time during the program you have difficulty hearing, please alert one of our staff members or student volunteers here in the hall, and they can assist you. And now please welcome Peter Muehlbach.
Thank you, Kevin. As you mentioned, my name is Peter Muehlbach, and I'm a senior studying chemical engineering here at KU, and I'm a member of the Self-Engineering Leadership Fellowship. As a part of this academic fellowship, seniors complete a capstone project in an area of engineering that relates to their personal interest. It has been a great honor for me to work with the Dole Institute to help organize this year's edition of the Innovation Series for my capstone project. And now for this evening's program. Our guest speakers will be interviewed tonight by the Dole Institute Director, Bill Lacey, who's closest to me. You'll find more detailed bios for our speakers in your program handouts, but please allow me to provide a brief introduction to each of them. We're thrilled to have them all here. On the far end is Jonathan Peters. He is an assistant professor of journalism at KU with an affiliate research position at the KU Information and Telecommunication Technology Center that's on West Campus here. He is the First Amendment chair of the American Bar Association's Civil Rights Litigation Committee and has written for many major publications, including the Harvard Law and Policy Review. In the middle is Chris Isaacson. He's an executive vice president of Global Chief Information Officer at BATS Global Markets and was a founding member of BATS in 2005. He began his career at Cerner Corporation. And closest to me is Bill Staples. He is a professor of sociology and founding director of the Surveillance Studies Research Center at KU. He has written several books on surveillance, social control, and historical sociology. Ladies and gentlemen, we hope you enjoy our discussion on privacy versus cybersecurity for nation, corporation, and citizen.
Please welcome our guests. Thanks to all of you for coming out tonight for this important discussion, and thanks, gentlemen, to you for joining us. I want to start, and Bill, I'll start with you, and we'll just work down the line here. Talk a little bit about why this topic is important to you and why cybersecurity is so important to our country.
So for me, I run technology and operations for BATS. Been a founding employee there since 2005. I oversee, as part of my remit, is security, both physical and information security. It's essential for our business, and it's essential for the soundness of financial markets and confidence that investors have in those markets. So we spend a lot of time on it, an increasing amount of time, as the attackers and threats become more and more prevalent and intelligent. But it's also a fascinating area of research and focus for us.
Chris, take just a moment. Tell everybody what BATS is.
Yeah, BATS Global Markets is we run securities markets, securities exchanges around the world. We're the #2 largest stock exchange in the U.S. We're about 22% of the entire U.S. stock exchange market on a given day. Any given day, we could be number one, larger than the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ. We're the number one stock exchange operator in Europe, bigger than the LSE and Euronext and other markets you might know there. We're about 10% of the U.S. options market as well, and we recently acquired a company called Hotspot, so we're now nearly 10%, roughly 10% of the spot currency trading market as well, so the global foreign exchange market. So we're at the core, we're a technology company that operates markets.
Okay, John?
Yeah, thanks. I'll just echo what they said. Thanks very much for coming out. And this works out well for me because I'm an attorney, and I'll just send you all a bill when we're done with this. This will jack my rates up. How did I get into cybersecurity and privacy and issues of surveillance? I am by trade a First Amendment lawyer, and I am interested in the idea that the freedom of expression is a system. It is not any one thing. And the practical ability to speak online depends on institutions, it depends on statutory frameworks, and it depends on technological design. Because we will have technologies that can enhance or inhibit freedom of speech, depending on how we design them. These are conscious choices that we make. Do we want them to respect privacy principles? Do we want them to enable the government more easily to surveil our communications activities? So it fits neatly within my interest in freedom of speech.
Okay. Can you gentlemen tell us what's a virtual profile?
John?
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Are you meaning colloquially or as a term of art or?
Just colloquially.
Colloquially?
Yeah.
Generally, when people talk about a virtual profile or some kind of social presence, social media presence and online presence, they're talking about the footprint, the identity, the fingerprints that you leave digitally with all of the things that you do online, anything from processing payments on PayPal to posting things publicly on Twitter, to engaging privately through private messages on Facebook. Everything that you do will leave a little trace behind you. It will leave breadcrumbs. Some of them are more easier to see than others, but they all will kind of holistically create some kind of online presence and or virtual profile that makes up who you are.
Yeah, we kind of sometimes refer to it as a virtual doppelganger. The notion of there's this mirror image of you out there, and one of the things that's sort of a concern about that is the idea that this virtual you is then potentially operated upon. So in other words, that decisions are made. We were talking earlier about algorithms and that say your credit score or other kinds of things might be affected without you actually even knowing about it. I used to give the example of a virtual doppelganger as these machines that collect this information that Jonathan was talking about become so good at doing that they become better representations of who we are. And I used to ask people when we used to rent videos at video stores, do you remember all the movies you watched last year? But Blockbuster does. So it's this idea that virtual doppelganger becomes a highly representation of you.
What kind of personal information makes up that profile? I mean, is it virtually anything that you respond to or enter or actions that you take online?
I think that's the trouble. I think it's anything you obviously explicitly are willing to share online, but it's also really a reflection of maybe the lack of your own security controls on your electronic devices, whatever those devices may be. So yes, I'm speaking from a corporate perspective and the employees, the number one security risk for us are our employees and the devices that they use. And therefore, because the bad guys are the ones that they can use any of those threat vectors to gather information about our employees and our company. So certainly anything you explicitly enter, but also any information you might have laying around your computer that's non-encrypted or non-secure.
That's right, and many things that you do online, they will create data points. The data points individually, they might not mean anything to somebody who would look at them. But if I can compile enough data points about you, I can create a profile. And that profile of you might tell me quite a bit about you. It could tell me a range for your annual income. It could tell me your political leanings. It could tell me your sexual orientation, whether you have STDs, whether you're treated for mental illness. These profiles can be created and sold and thereby bought by others that are mostly involved in commercial marketing activities. So if these are generally called data brokers. It is a very lightly regulated industry. By way of example, you can go to one of 3 major data brokers in the United States and you can buy lists of names of American citizens who have been identified as people with mental illnesses, who have been identified as lesbian or gay, who have been identified as people who in the last year have purchased a sex toy, and then you can market to them accordingly. I think it comes as a tremendous surprise to most people that these types of data are available and that they are as highly personal and identifiable as they are.
Yeah, one of those data brokers, Xicon Corporation, has, I think it's 500 million individuals identified in their data set with 1,500 data points. And they've made a concession recently, as Jonathan was saying, they're a very unregulated industry. They made a concession recently where you can go online and look at what they have on you. And it's quite easy to find. I don't remember exactly the URL for it. It's interesting because then you have to give them a bunch of information to get access to it. So it's the question of who owns this information and who controls it, and these larger issues about, again, this kind of doppelganger, and if it's our information, why do I have to request my credit score, for example? It's my score, it's about me. And yet somehow this is treated as something that's outside of me that I don't have control over.
Okay. What are some of the differences between the kind of information that corporations or the government or maybe an identity thief might be looking for in terms of online stuff that you submitted?
I don't know. My guess is that most of it, if it's quote unquote personal information, all 3 of those entities are interested in it. And some of them exchange it. I mean, I think it's quite clear that there's been a fairly significant corporate use or sharing of data with government agencies in the sort of post 9/11 NSA scandal and issues that we've seen. There's been major cooperation by the telecommunications industry and others. So companies are collecting this information. I mentioned Xicon. They apparently shared information on the 9/11 hijackers not soon after 9/11. So that there's a lot of this exchanging going on among them.
Yeah, I mean, for us, we don't, our customers are broker dealers. We don't have any personal, no PII information, no private confidential information for, for any retail investors. But our real focus is around potential attacks to the stability of the financial system and folks that might be trying to do distributed denial of service attacks against, critical infrastructure of one, we run part of that critical infrastructure. So it's not really about personal information. It's more about systemic information, market information. Frankly, I have to say, I think what we're most concerned about as an exchange operator, we take our responsibilities very seriously, is the security of our customers. We can control our walls as good as we can, but when our customers connect to us over electronic APIs, our systems, as long as they comply with those APIs, those customers have to have their own security controls in place to ensure their systems haven't been compromised. So as long as they're complying, it's sometimes hard to know, to prevent whether or not they're sending us appropriate orders, and that's why we do surveillance on the backside after trading has occurred, as trading is occurring, to make sure if there's any spurious activity that's going on, we're monitoring all activity in real time, such that if there's some market manipulation that has to do with cybersecurity, that it's seen in real time and we can stamp it out.
And from the journalist perspective, the information that we find most sensitive, it would be the identity of confidential sources that we work with. It would be unpublished information. It could be story drafts, source notes, anything that would be highly revealing of somebody to whom we have made a promise of confidentiality. And we think about the risks to those types of data points in two fundamental ways. We think about the technological risks to them, the possibility that somebody digitally could pick our pockets, and we think about the legal risks to them, that somebody could use a legal writ, either a subpoena or a search warrant. Probably today, most likely, it would be served on a third party. So it would be a cloud service provider, by way of example. If any of you have used, say, Dropbox, the service provider that enables you to store data in a third-party server, so that's not one that's on your local hard drive. The legal landscape as it exists today allows an interested party, whether it is a government actor or a non-government actor, to serve a legal writ, most likely a subpoena, on that third party. And if you shroud that request in what's called a gag order, which is a legal order telling the recipient you can't speak about this thing that you have just received, that would forbid Dropbox, say, from coming and telling me that we just received a subpoena for John Peters and his source notes. So I would be left in the cold wondering, just simply not knowing that some other actor had obtained access behind my back to information that I had stored with a third party. So again, we're thinking about sources, unpublished information, and increasingly thinking about it in two ways, both legally and technologically.
Okay. I'm not going to direct very many questions to a specific person, but Chris, I'd like you to think and respond to this, if you would. What kind of information is, and use your own examples, what kind of information is exchanged between government and business, and why is the security of that information so absolutely important?
Yeah, so the exact types of information that's exchanged are, IP addresses where we're maybe seeing spurious activity from, wherever it may be coming from in the world. Activity that we might be seeing within our, different security systems, and also, it's in both directions. But I would say,
excuse me, Chris, could you speak up a little bit?
Yeah, sure.
A couple of folks in the back are having a little bit.
Yeah, sorry about
hearing.
that. So there's IP addresses that we might be seeing spurious activity coming from around the world. That could be, the government could be seeing that, or we could be seeing that. That could be shared both ways. But I have to say that amount of sharing, frankly, between us and the government is relatively small. That most of the sharing that's going on is within the industry. So financial services, there's a sector group called Isaacson. It's an information sharing group for financial services that's very active. So one example was there was a distributed denial of service attack. It was been 3 or 4 years ago against many firms in the financial services space, 3 or 4 of the exchanges, a few large broker-dealers, names that you've heard of before. And there was very quick information sharing amongst security professionals about where those attacks were coming from, so that you could quickly block those actors from doing their activity. It's very essential because, I don't want to paint too dim of a picture. Whenever we talk about security or cybersecurity, it seems like a very negative topic. Frankly, it's not like you don't walk out of here and you're all cheered up, but because there are bad actors in the world, but most of the interfaces the financial services industry has, or at least the exchange industry has, are not exposed to the internet. I have to say, for instance, all the orders that we accept to our exchanges around the world, they don't come over an internet connection. They come over a leased circuit, cross-connect within a data center. What we're talking about is activity toward a website that might expose read-only data about trading activity. Now, it is important with financial information, is with your bank accounts and everything. There is internet. Obviously, there is internet exposure because you need to interact with your internet bank account via your phone or your website or whatever it might be. So it's absolutely essential. I don't know that I don't have the exact statistics about how much money's stolen from banks over online fraud, but I know it's hundreds of millions of dollars likely, and so that's why it's important that government and financial services are aware of who those actors are, because it's huge businesses, black businesses that are being created from this sort of cyber fraud.
Okay. One of the central issues our society faces is this whole notion of national security versus individual privacy and individual rights. And I want to spend a few minutes having you gentlemen address that topic. And as a starting point, can you talk a little bit about the kind of surveillance that the National Security Agency is involved in and the kinds of information that they're collecting?
Well, I think I tend to reject this outright, this idea of security versus privacy. I think that creates a situation in which we think that somehow we can't have one without the other. And so it just seems to me that if we give up the first, in terms of privacy rights and a collective sense of autonomy and control, with this idea of this bargain that we're going to get security out of it, we do that and the first one is lost, okay? It's gone guaranteed, for what I think is really not a guarantee of security. So if you look at the history of the NSA, for example, just 5 days ago, the Obama administration released a formerly classified report on a program that was started under George Bush soon after or after 9/11 called Stellar Wind. And it was an illegal program to do mass collection of data of phone and internet communication of the American people. And it was a violation of the FISA Act, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. It was later made legal by Congress in 2007, after it was revealed in 2005 by the New York Times and some other news outlets. They've just released a report that said that Stellar Wind produced not a single bit of useful information. Not a single bit of useless. Read the New York Times, it's a story about it. It has the actual document. So this notion somehow that that we are trading this in for this information, the fact that there's serious questions about whether that kind of data collection actually works. And finally, I would look at the incidents that we've had, the Boston bombing. The brothers were security agencies were aware of them. There was a record of them. The FBI knew about them. In the case in Paris, the attack on the cartoon newspaper, they were alerted to French authorities. So this question that somehow more and more data is going to make us safer, I think, is a fallacy. And I'll stop there.
I'll jump in here. From a journalist perspective, I would say that surveillance is one spoke in a much larger wheel. We do think about surveillance, obviously, in a post-Snowden environment. You have to. But we also think about a lot of other digital threats to the information that we have and the communications that we engage in. So some of the other things that we think about, in addition to what Bill just discussed with regard to surveillance, we think about software and hardware attacks. We think about which encompasses the ability of some actor to compromise your computer using some kind of infected piece of software or an infected hardware that they give you to use. We think about things like phishing attacks. So a phishing attack is an email sent to you. This is typically how it works. It is an email sent to you or a link sent to you via social media. When you download the attachment from the email or you click the link in social media, you will download with it. Or when you access the web page, you will access that page, and with that page will come some kind of malware. It will be some kind of virus. The viruses come in many shapes and sizes. So I'll just give you one example. One of them could come with what's called a key logger, which is a little piece of code that can track every keystroke that you make in your computer. That includes any passwords that you would input. That includes any private communications that you might have, in otherwise encrypted communications. So this is one example of a type of end run that you can make around encryption technologies if you have an effective implemented keylogger. Something else that we'll think about, Chris mentioned distributed denial of service attacks. This is the ability of a number of actors in concert to overwhelm your computer servers. So it's essentially a bunch of people trying to make connection with the same server at the same time, and it is so voluminous that it overwhelms the capacity of the server. And the result is to shut down your website. For news organizations, this can be devastating because if you're trying to distribute a news story online, your site is down. This is also very costly. There have been studies done in the last 6 months that have shown that news organizations alone in the last year have had 42% of them have reported some kind of denial of service attack. Denial of service attacks are also expensive for the organizations that are targeted. For a small to medium-sized organization, it very often will cost the organization $50,000 in IT cost to repair the damage that was done and get the systems up and running again. For a larger organization, the average cost is $450,000. So this speaks not only to the bottom line, but again, the ability of a news organization to distribute its content. So kind of circling back to the main point, we think about and we're deeply concerned by surveillance, but it's just kind of one arrow in the quiver that we've got our eyes on.
And I'll say, from my perspective, surveillance is a positive word in some ways because we view it as surveillance of our systems, sure, of all file integrity. Data loss prevention is another word in the security space where we're looking for exfiltration of key, critical, confidential information within our walls, proprietary information. In addition to the surveillance I already talked about, which was surveillance of the market, surveillance of trading activity of different members. It's very important that we understand how our members, we have a regulatory obligation to understand how they're trading, how they're using our systems, and whether or not it's according to fair and orderly markets. So I think it can be a bad word for some people. I think it's a good word. I think it just needs to be used in its proper use. It is good.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me ask you this question, gentlemen, is do you think the surveillance and information gathering by the NSA and other government agencies goes too far? Somebody's listening into this.
Somebody's
listening. So be careful what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. As we've come to understand these programs, I believe that they have. As I said earlier, they've been illegal, questionably constitutional. There was a lot of maneuvering to try to justify them legally, mostly under the Patriot Act Section 215, which is a wide open door to do the kinds of things that were done. I think they violate most of the principles that many Americans hold dear in terms of that there's some kind of, that there needs to be some kind of warrant, there needs to be some kind of justification for collecting information about us, particularly in this dragnet wholesale fashion of, get it all is the line, is the, and I think it represents a very panicked response after 9/11. We responded in a way that I think we lost, to some extent, lost our way. And it was a terrifying moment for the United States, and I think I think the measure of a country is how it deals with adversity. And I think in those ways we could have done a better job in terms of protecting the American people.
I'll jump in again from the journalist's perspective. I do think that it has gone too far in general. I followed with some interest the discussions about government regulation of encryption technologies and the idea that perhaps the designers of the encryption technologies and the designers of the hardware, pieces of hardware themselves, should enable the government either to have a key, that there would be a two-key system that would allow the company itself, the producer of those devices, along with the government, that when you put those two keys together, you would be able to unencrypt all of the private encrypted information on it. So that is one example of an ongoing debate regarding, have we gone too far? Do we need to go further? And in that case, I have a hard time accepting the idea that a hardware company could be made to build in a structural defect in its encryption system to make it more convenient for the government to surveil your private communications. Because the government is making the promise effectively that, we will only use this with good cause with a government warrant. And I think we've already seen plenty of evidence that shows, they've done this without government warrants in a number of cases. And so the other thing is, if you build in that kind of structural defect into a piece of software or hardware, that defect can be used by people other than the government and other than the company that would have the other key. So for example, it would make the piece of technology more vulnerable to other hackers. It can make it more vulnerable to foreign governments. And so, I don't know in light of that, that it is altogether the most effective thing to do that would be in the best interest of the company to begin building in defects in our technological designs. Kind of circling back to one of the points I made earlier, recognizing that the freedom of expression is a system. It is more than any one thing, and one of the pieces in that system is technological design.
Do you think Americans should be concerned about how much information that U.S. corporations and businesses are gathering about them?
We'll go in order here.
I think yes. I think not just American corporations, but you should be concerned about your own virtual profile and what information you're sharing on social websites, any websites, any place you're sharing your own information. And it's had rise to organizations like LifeLock and Secure ID and others to protect your profile, make sure that it's accurate. You should be concerned. I'm frankly not a conspiracy theorist. I'm not that interesting, really. But I think it's all, I guess I grew up with technology. I'm a technologist, and I feel like it's my responsibility to at least be aware of maybe what they're collecting and protect myself from how it might be used against me.
Mm-hmm. I think personal responsibility and awareness are a big part of it, because when you think about the number of websites that you might interact with daily, it is becoming increasingly important for us to do even the most basic human activities, to do them online. Everything from banking to here at KU paying tuition, signing up for classes. We all communicate and arrange meetings by digital devices. And so there are a lot of basic life functions that are either enabled by, made easier by, or that technology is essential to. And so the idea that you could, to the extent that somebody would make this argument, that you should just opt out if you're uncomfortable with it, I think that's an impractical and untenable idea. And so I think you need to be aware, on the one hand, yes, of the types of information that various websites collect about you. Take, for example, Facebook. We voluntarily give Facebook a lot of information about us. Much of that is on you, for showing a willingness to do that. Facebook is free in part because you are the product. You are the product being sold to some advertiser or some other service. And I think you have to keep that in mind. But likewise, when you use, let's say, an online dating service like OkCupid, if you were to go, there are a couple of different applications that will enable you when you go to a website to see how many other sets of eyeballs from other companies and services have bought the right to kind of follow you around on that website. When you fill out, for example, your online dating profile, and then you move from there and you fill out a bunch of questionnaires about, do you want to date somebody who's 5'10", somebody who's 6'5", somebody who's athletic, who likes going on walks, all of that information is being packaged by and available to third parties that are following you around. When you use the applications that enable you to see that, it really looks like a bunch of spiders on a web that are just kind of floating around. Those are all of the eyeballs on you. So that, I think, is a less transparent version of the Facebook problem. That when you go to Facebook, I think you've got a greater expectation, that whatever you put on your profile could be used by Facebook to sell it to some third party. But when you go to, say, a content farm or a website like OkCupid, I don't think that many people are aware that their presence there and their activities there are being tracked and followed in general.
How concerned should...
I was just going to add one.
Go ahead.
This notion, I think, that we have, at least in the U.S., is that we have to individually go out of our way to protect our privacy. And not only that, we have to now buy more products from companies that are selling the idea that we have to protect ourselves from other companies. And I start to...
You find that objectionable?
I find that objectionable.
Just to be clear.
And this is speaking to some of the engineering students here that organize this thing, why can't we design in from the beginning the idea that protecting privacy is an important social good? Why can't we have a regulatory environment in which corporations and others are held accountable for the kind of description that Jonathan's, it's incredible. And I hate to do the usual, but the European countries, the EU has, the European Data Directive has a law that protects privacy of people online. American corporations routinely get into trouble. Google is now being sued by the EU for violations of their privacy protection laws. When they operate here, they get away with doing all kinds of things. It's kind of the Wild West. And I just think that as citizens, we ought to have much more of a push for a regulatory environment that says no, that these things aren't just taken for granted. We shouldn't have to defend them as individuals or go buy some other device to help us, so.
How concerned should citizens be about stolen identities, about business collecting information about them, about foreign powers hacking the defense department or a defense contractor or terrorists or any of that? I mean, how secure are our computer systems and our databases, and what kind of fears should we actually have about that?
I think one bit of evidence that there is a very high-level concern is that for the last 2 weeks, both the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of Homeland Security have been going on a Silicon Valley tour.
Yeah.
And they have met with leaders at Facebook, at Google, at Twitter. They spent a couple of days at Stanford University talking with computer scientists and engineering students there, heavily recruiting them to come work for the federal government, to work for the CIA, the NSA, to try to bulk up their cybersecurity protocols. So I think that that's evidence that the U.S. government, probably more than ever, I think in large part because of General Alexander's push on the cybersecurity front, who's the director of the NSA, I think that Snowden greatly accelerated what was already a pretty quickly moving ball. And beyond that, I'll piggyback on one comment that Bill made too about the European data directives. When you look at United States laws and regulations governing basic data security and governing in particular the privacy of your electronic communications, this area is really a mess. There is no one law that is supposed to protect you from government surveillance. We have a composite of laws. We have the Fourth Amendment, which protects us from unreasonable searches and seizures. We have the Stored Communications Act, passed in 1986. We have the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, also passed in 1986. And then for journalists, we've got something called the Privacy Protection Act of 1980. So all of these, as you can tell, these were drafted in the 80s. These were drafted about 20 years before Google and Amazon even existed. And I mention those two in particular because they are the two largest providers of cloud service in the world. We think of Amazon as a purveyor of goods. That we go to Amazon, we buy books, we buy shoes, but Amazon actually makes most of its money from its cloud computing service, where it rents out server space to people like you. By way of example, they used to host part of the DoD website, they used to host part of the CIA website. At the same time, they hosted the WikiLeaks website in 2010. So you can imagine the awkward conflicts that they had when that was going on. And the other use journalistically that people are making of the cloud, if you rewind to say 2009, Pulitzer Prize, no, he's not a Pulitzer Prize winner. He probably wishes he were, but he's not. It's Charles Duhigg, the investigative reporter for the New York Times. A great reporter, covers the science beat. He did a big investigative series on, it was the failures of the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act. In doing that, he had developed, it was about 200 million data points that he needed to park somewhere. And he went to the New York Times and said to the chief information officer there, hey, can we store 200 million data points on the local server? He said, of course not. That would overwhelm the New York Times. So they went to Amazon and they said, can we use, it's the Elastic Compute Cloud Service, the EC2 service, which basically makes web-scaled computing more efficient and more effective, and said, can we rent server space from you and park the data there, and then that will help Duhigg kind of build the database around his reporting and guide his reporting. So they did that, and it got me thinking, what happens if the government or a non-government actor takes an interest in that? And they send a third-party subpoena, some other legal writ to Amazon, and saying, please show us what Duhigg has been collecting and putting in the Amazon cloud. The application of the Electronic Communications Act, the Stored Communications Act, the Fourth Amendment, the Privacy Protection Act, it is really unclear. These haven't been updated since the 1980s. Which obviously is long before the commercial internet as we know it, and even longer before cloud computing as we know it.
Okay. I've run out of time tonight, and we always open up to Q&A, and if my students are listening, I usually give them a cue so they get out here with their microphones, and I didn't get to give them the cue tonight. So if my students will come out with their cordless microphones, we'll open it up to your Q&A, and here they are. If you have a question for any of our guests, please raise your hand. One of our students will find you. Please ask a direct question, no statements, and you can either direct it to one of the panelists or just to them as a group. Okay, we'll start right here.
Yes, gentlemen. Considering the fact that the State Department and the Pentagon supposedly have these secured and classified servers, yet they're being hacked into by numerous countries and people, given the fact, as you've alluded to, that weak regulations by corporations and the government, lack of transparency by corporations and the government, it seems to me that we don't really have any security to speak of, or grossly inadequate, and it seems to me that we really don't have, our privacies are being subtly and systematically eradicated. So could you all address that? And yes, Mr. Lacey, we are being listened to, so, okay.
Who wants to jump in on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess I agree. I mean, from the cybersecurity point, the Sony hack was a huge wake-up call because here you had what supposedly, I guess, has been verified, a foreign government attacking a U.S. corporation and doing considerable amount of damage. But it was startling, and from what I understand, it wasn't even all that sophisticated a hack. So I think we are vulnerable. I think it goes back to your question about fear, although we have to be careful about fear and what it does to us in terms of the kind of, again, what I meant about post 9/11 and how we respond to things. I mean, Chris can talk about the corporate world, but I mean, I think it was a wake-up call to most organizations, both public and private in the United States, about protection.
Yeah, and I would agree. There was not a terribly sophisticated hack, but as with the Target hack, for instance, that was not a very sophisticated hack either. But there was well-worn alerts that were ignored within the security organization within Target that led to the downfall of a lot of corporate turnover in the executive level, and Target's still recovering from that. So, I mean, you have to take it very seriously, and I've met security professionals here in the crowd tonight, and there's only so much expertise out there, and there's a gap between the demand and supply of security expertise, and the incentives that those that are good and bad actors have to to share their expertise.
And I'll add one more log to the fire that probably will just demoralize you even more in response to your question. There was a story that broke last week about federal inspectors general. And the story is that the Washington Post did an investigative report on websites of inspector generals. And they all include some kind of submission system. So if you are a government employee who wants to behave as a whistleblower and file a confidential, anonymous complaint about some fraud or some other abuse going on within your government agency, you should be able to go to the submission system and submit it. What the Washington Post found was the majority of those submission systems were unencrypted, which means that some third party, including the Inspector General, him or herself, the Office of the Inspector General, if it so wanted, and so far there's no evidence that this has happened, that they could just take a peek at whatever it is you're submitting, supposedly confidentially and anonymously. A couple of the agencies that were included among those that have not encrypted their submission systems, the State Department, the Department of Justice, and the Department of Homeland Security.
Okay, next question right here.
Thank you. Let's see, so Professor Peters, I think you alluded to it already. Both the current director of the FBI and President Obama's security coordinator both released statements arguing that hardware vendors should include in hardware and firmware in order to aid the NSA, for example, backdoors that allows the government to access data. Could the panel discuss what the potential threats of such a policy would be to, one, business confidence if the entirety of the infrastructure was no longer algorithmically secure, and two, what threat from a proliferation perspective such a policy would pose should the knowledge of those backdoors fall in the hands of either non-state or state actors?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, the threat is significant on that because I remember having a conversation in 2011, when the DOMA bill was before Congress. And the DOMA bill, well, it was, or not DOMA, it was SOPA and PIPA, I'm sorry, I don't know why DOMA came to mind. SOPA and PIPA bills were before Congress, and what they wanted to do was regulate what has come to be known as piracy, the use of somebody else's intellectual property without authorization. And one of the elements of both SOPA and PIPA was to insert a mechanism into the domain name system that would permit the government, if it so chose, unilaterally without a hearing to close down a website. And the authority rested exclusively with the Attorney General of the United States. And I remember I just happened to be interviewing at the time, it was a guy named Jack Balkin, who is the Knight Chair in Constitutional Law at Yale Law School. And he is a super uber expert on all things technology law, and I asked him about it, what do you think about the idea? And he said, I worry about it because it's kind of an if you build it, they will come mentality, that if you begin building into our technology infrastructure these defects and intentional levers that somebody could pull to censor speech, to close off speech, to make it easier for somebody to surveil you, then they are more likely to take advantage of those tools if they have them easily at their disposal. So as a threat, I worry about the encouragement of encouraging the use of those tools simply by building them. And then, the proliferation, sure, I think that's an equally valid point that many other countries, in particular democratic countries, take their cues from us on technological design issues. And I'm sure that if Russia would see that we're doing this or China would see that we're doing this, they would love to adopt a similar either rule or regulation or some kind of practice that would compel their own producers to do the same. And the interesting thing is too, so if the United States does this, requiring American producers of technology at home to build in these defects, that rule by law cannot apply to devices produced outside of the United States. So you've already run into a gigantic bandsaw of an exception, that if you just buy a device in London, bring it back, then you've already gotten around the problem.
Okay, we have a question right here.
Okay, so you guys have really done a great job of elaborating the problems and some of the issues that, like I said, building that lever increases the potential that somebody will eventually pull it. And Bill, you kind of held up the EU as, they had some potential, better than what we currently have. So my question is, how do we get closer to something like what the EU has when the whole system is kind of a, the marketers and the corporations are the one that are talking to the people that could possibly change those laws. So it's kind of a, I'm patting your back, you're patting mine. There's no incentive on either side to go that way. So where do you even start?
Yeah, wow. No, it's a really good question. I wish I had a simple answer, but it's, I turn to kind of like social movements theory. We need a social movement. We need people that, instead of when I talk about surveillance and many of these issues, I get a lot of the, well, I don't really care, it doesn't affect me, et cetera, et cetera. And I think there's a level of complacency about it that undermines any kind of potential political pressure. Although there's certainly a number of very powerful groups, sort of NGOs, the ACLU and a number of others the Electronic Frontier privacy groups and et cetera, that I think are constantly pushing for these things. And they do get the ear of powerful people in Washington. Given the political climate, given the back patting, as you're implying, I think, in terms of post Citizens United decision, which means that there's an enormous amount of money in politics these days. And the people who have that money are the ones that are interested in that data and that control. But stranger things have happened, in terms of turning some tide. And sometimes it's something like the Snowden incident, or it's data breaches that we're seeing in public, that these kind of things make people aware of these issues. And I think the fact that we're even having this discussion is a good start to get that going.
On the reform efforts too, it's a group that is collectively calling itself Digital Due Process that has been trying to reform the Electronic Communications Privacy Act for years now, because that is one of the bills I mentioned to you that was passed in 1986. It hasn't really been updated since then. And it is a very strange law. And this is the law that is supposed to protect the privacy of your email. I will give you an example of its strangeness. It says that if you have an email stored in your inbox longer than 6 months, you lose the privacy interest in that email, which means that a government actor can search it without checking with you. And so you think about that and you wonder, why is that? It's basically because in 1986, the internet as it existed then, in its extremely limited form, and the way that we communicated electronically then, the internet itself was not a place where we stored stuff. We just didn't have the bandwidth. We used it essentially to transmit things. And so the nature of the internet has fundamentally changed, where now we use it to store things. We have greater bandwidth, we've got greater storage capacity. And so the theory was in 1986, if we put a limit on it, anything that you leave there without acting on it in some way for more than 6 months, we assume that it's unimportant to you. And if it's unimportant to you, because given the very limited capacity that we had in the 1980s, you would have done something with it immediately if it were important, and you would have gotten rid of it. So today, though, of course, my inbox, I looked at it today, I think I've got 28,000 emails in there, and I've got something like 15 gigs worth of saved crap. Do I need any of it? No, but do I have it? Of course. I've got it there just in case. And so the nature of the internet has changed. The nature of online communication has changed, completely antiquating things like the ECPA. But to piggyback off what Bill said, unfortunately, the reforms have died over and over again. They can't get traction in Congress, in part because of the greasy hands that have been working over many of the key legislators.
I will say though, just you have 15 gigs of emails, I have 15 years of email and Gmail. I was one of the first users, I think. You become addicted to these services, frankly. They're so very, very useful that you make I think a lot of users make just a cost-benefit analysis.
Sure.
Say, I need to use this service. I mean, it becomes this massive store that's effectively free for you. And, you know, as John said, as rightly said, you're selling information to these firms, but, you know, each individual has to make their own decision. I think education is the key. You need to educate yourself about what information is being used from the terms and conditions when you sign up to these websites. And also say, you know, kind of off topic, but as we finish up here, I think from a security perspective, if there's one thing I'd leave you with, from a personal security perspective, manage your passwords appropriately.
Yeah.
It's very, very simple, but don't use the same password all your, I mean, it's very simple stuff, but you should become very sophisticated about how you manage passwords. From, you know, once you're into a site, then it's on you to determine, you know, what information you're going to share. But a lot of people are hacked because they're using poor passwords. It's as simple as that.
And poor security questions too. If your security questions are obvious and easily guessable, so if you know it's the street that you grew up on, if these are things that I could find if I did a little Googling around, you probably don't want to use those as your security questions.
Like my Gmail account, it's 54-character password.
Man.
You know.
That's
Did I create it? No, I generated it. You know.
Okay, I have a question back here.
How can the intelligence and defense community strike a balance between innovating with technology and what you alluded to is the lagging legal framework that they operate under, since legal parameters not only hinder legal collection, but as well as the cybersecurity of private citizens?
Yeah. I'll use the Privacy Protection Act as an example. The Privacy Protection Act is an act that came about in 1980 in response to a 1978 U.S. Supreme Court opinion. There was a search of the student newspaper at Stanford University, and the case went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the question was, does the First Amendment or the Fourth Amendment prohibit a search and seizure with a warrant of a newsroom, on the theory that it could have a chilling effect on a newsroom? The U.S. Supreme Court came back emphatically and said, no, that is not a problem constitutionally, you can search it. So Congress then passed the PPA. It was a couple of years later, Congress thought, boy, that's a bad idea from a policy standpoint to empower law enforcement agencies generally at will to be able to go in and search newsrooms. So the Congress passed the PPA, which is probably the last favorable thing Congress has ever done for the press. And the PPA says it's a somewhat complicated law, but it basically tells law enforcement agencies that they have to get a subpoena rather than a search warrant before they can search anything that is in the possession of somebody engaged in First Amendment activities. And the key word there for me that sticks out as an interesting one is possession. What does it mean in a digital world to possess something? And if you take the PPA and say the Charles Duhigg example I gave you from the New York Times, he parks all the data up in the Amazon cloud. Who possesses those data? Does Amazon possess them? Does Charles Duhigg possess them? And what does that mean for PPA protection if it says that you are protected according to the things that you possess? There are principled arguments that can go back and forth on that issue. One point that I have made, I think to the chagrin of some law enforcement agents, is if you accept the idea that on the one hand might seem like a good one for law enforcement, that I want to argue that you as a journalist do not possess those data, because then that gets me around the PPA. But on the other hand, let's say that 5 days later, you bump into somebody who is storing child pornography in an Amazon cloud. Would the law enforcement agency then want to say, well, you don't possess that? You know, that's just Amazon, so if you park it up there, you're fine. I think it would create some really bizarre unintended policy consequences. And I mention that as an example because the PPA, 1980 was when it was drafted, last amended in 1996. In 1996, they added some language that really didn't materially change the act. The PPA has never been applied in the cloud computing era. It has only been applied once to online journalists, and that was in 1994. And that was a case involving, it was a dual publishing house. It had an online publishing arm and it had a print publishing arm. The court that decided the case ignored the fact that it was an online publishing arm and said, we're basing this on the fact that you were a print publisher. This is the approach that you see courts take, I think, in general, because one of the major culprits here in responding to your question, the ability to update some of these antiquated laws, it's the ability, frankly, of judges and courts around the country to understand the technologies that they're dealing with and to apply them effectively to emerging media. We had, it was I think 5 years ago at the U.S. Supreme Court, they decided a case involving beeper technology. And so you think, this is 5 years ago at the U.S. Supreme Court, and they're dealing with beepers. And do I trust them to address issues of third-party, consent and privacy in the cloud? No, of course not. Beepers are new to them.
Oh, that one was amazing. Okay.
I can't follow the beeper.
I was wondering if you could talk about the market for cybersecurity insurance. To be honest, I'm not too concerned about the government trying to find my personal information. I'm more concerned that a data breach or a cyber terrorism act on a company may cause a certain level of financial damage that my tax dollars or other citizens' tax dollars would have to go to bailing out a company.
That sounds like your,
This is mine.
that's yours.
I can't say I can add a whole lot here. I mean, as a company, it's something we've investigated, and I can't really say exactly where we've landed on it, but it's something that I think corporations are really wrestling with right now. Should corporations and other entities, should we be investing in cybersecurity insurance or not? I can just say that at the board level, security is becoming the topic du jour for every meeting that we have. And insurance is one of those topics that comes up on a regular basis. So I don't think there's any silver bullet answer to your question. I think defining insurance is very, very hard because you have to define the events or the incidents in advance that would be covered by that insurance, which is nearly impossible because it changes at the speed of technology. And I think that's, just as John was talking about, it's difficult to, insurance can't keep up with the speed of technological change, which drives security breaches. Neither can the law. That's just the world we live in.
Okay. Do we have a question in the back? Okay, great.
Many of us are on prescription drugs these days. How likely is it that a hacker could get into my set of prescription drugs and alter them at my doctor's office or at my pharmacy in such a way that it would jeopardize my health or threaten my life?
Oh.
I don't know if any of us know.
I don't know. I think most times you think of hackers and what their motivation is, and that would seem more criminal in the sense of trying to actually hurt you as a person. I think those data are actually vulnerable, and there's lots of cases in which pharmacies have been very sloppy with data, throwing computers out that have huge stores of data on them. So I think, like all our personal information, I think that information, and issues about medical records is enormous right now. So my guess is that it's quite vulnerable. I'm less thinking about hacking it and changing it for some reason.
And I would add about the security calculus that many organizations make. Operational cybersecurity is not a one-size-fits-all affair. It is tailored, and you have to think first about threats. Well, first you think about assets. What do you have that you want to protect? Then you think about threats to those assets. What are the risks here? And then you should consider, what is the actual likelihood that those risks and those threats will materialize? I would think and hope that hospitals, though perhaps this is more wishful thinking than not, would have considered the threats and the possibilities endemic in the kind of scenario that you just outlined. But it depends too, because systems are complicated. The systems are multi-headed beasts, and it's almost like your house. If you go home tonight and you lock all of your doors, and you put padlocks on your doors, and then you leave your windows open. That obviously is not going to be an effective way to keep an intruder out. So if you're talking about, say, a medical provider or a hospital, maybe they've got one set of systems locked down but not another. I think I couldn't game off the top of my head how likely it would be, that would be a real threat, a real risk of a threat. But at least, in general, you would run through that basic calculation as a medical provider.
Okay, we're going to take two more questions. We have one right here.
The gentleman from BATS. Do you think that there's more of an insider threat or an outsider threat when it comes to your digital assets? And do you think it's changing? Either you're worried about data leaking out, or that there's a malicious person inside of it, or are you worried more about an outside attacker?
I'd say I'm equally concerned, frankly. As companies grow, I think it's been shown actually that some of the deepest threats are within the company, within organizations. But certainly, financial services is sometimes easy to hate. Big companies that you maybe don't want to like. We're a startup company from 10 years ago, an entrepreneurial story, but I'm just as concerned about internal associates as I am about external attacks from people performing distributed denial of service attacks. I think that's from a corporate culture, I would say, BATS, we have 250 employees. It's a very collegial, familial company. I've been there from the beginning. I enjoy it. But from a security perspective, our CISO oversees that for us, and his job is to be paranoid, and that includes paranoia around internal associates. There has to be some level of distrust in order to make sure that we protect the company from intruders, from adversaries, internal and external.
Okay, last question right here.
So the government has a legitimate interest in issuance of identity credentials. We get driver's licenses and birth certificates and the like. Is there a class of security problem or privacy problem, either one, where the government stepping up and issuing digital identities is applicable to solving that problem?
Yeah, I have a friend, David Lyon, who's a sociologist and studies surveillance, and he has a book out called Playing the Identity Card, and there's lots of discussions about that internationally, and there's some countries that have gone to it. There's pluses and minuses, and it seems like it would clean up various things, particularly our state-bound identities in terms of driver's license and things like that. But there's always this growing concern about centralized information. On the other hand, especially if you're going to do that today, it's more than likely going to involve some kind of biometric identity, and that raises all kinds of issues. But again, cross-culturally, it's so different. There's certain countries where that's not necessarily a concern, and oddly, you go to places like Europe, and the Danes have health records of every single person in the country on file and centralized, and they don't worry about it. They don't see it as a problem, and so I think national ID cards are. I think we've been moving in that direction in the last few years, and I'm curious to see what's going to happen in the U.S.
Okay. Gentlemen, thank you very much for a very enlightening discussion tonight. Thank you all for coming out. Peter, thanks for your help on this program tonight. And we will be doing a select number of programs this summer, so stay tuned to find out about that. And we'll see you all back in fall for a full schedule. Thank you very much for your support.